that we have let you down very badly indeed.
We're used to it now, seeing the cut and thrust of the House of Commons in our TV sets.
And I wish everyone, friend or foe, well, and that is that, the end.
But it wasn't always like that. It was 20 years ago, in November 1989, that the cameras began daily coverage of proceedings in the House of Commons. Now, I was lucky enough to be at Westminster in those days, and I can tell you there were tremendously exciting times. That pioneering team was treading new ground. But the story of letting in the cameras goes back a lot further than me turning up. In fact, it goes back to the very earliest days of the BBC. In 1923, John Reith, the first Director General, asked if he could broadcast live on radio the King's speech from the House of Lords. Now, the House of Lords authorities wouldn't let him, but decades later, peers did turn out to be a lot more helpful than MPs. In February 1968, an experimental broadcast from the House of Lords took place. Though the catch was, it was allowed to be watched in only a couple of parliamentary offices.
Lord Inglewood.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the first question on the paper, standing in my name.
No, my Lords. Exports of agricultural machinery to Rhodesia from this country have been prohibited since February 1966 because of the declaration of illegal independence. This policy has been agreed by both Houses of Parliament, and it would be wrong to make exceptions.
This experiment lasted only a couple of weeks, and it took peers another decade and a half to decide it wasn't so bad. But broadcasting of the House of Lords on a permanent basis finally began in 1984. So while members of the Lords were busy getting themselves on camera, what were MPs of the Commons up to? Well, they've been concentrating on radio. In 1968, there was a 4-week experimental broadcast that seems to have gone down well enough for members of the Broadcasting Subcommittee to recommend that it should be made permanent. Except most of their colleagues seem to have disagreed. In fact, it wasn't until the summer of 1975 that people could tune in their radios and listen to broadcasts from the Commons over there.
Order. It may be my imagination, but I am under the impression that questions and answers have been longer today, and I cannot understand the reason why.
But at least voters could now hear their MPs, even if they couldn't see them. There were several attempts to let the cameras in as well as the microphones, but vote after vote was lost, some extremely narrowly. One reason they cited was television might follow radio's Yesterday in Parliament and not treat their words as though they were written in tablets of stone. But of course that's before I started working on Yesterday in Parliament. But in February 1988, a Conservative backbencher, Anthony Nelson, tried again, with a motion calling on cameras to be let in for an experimental period.
It was a free vote, although Margaret Thatcher let her acolytes know that she was opposed, but it was a genuinely cross-party issue. But you know, by the mid-80s, most people had a television, the opinion polls were in favour, and the House of Lords had already had an experiment which had proved not to be the political disaster that some parliamentary backwoodsmen thought it was. But you know, I think the biggest issue, which I tried to deploy in my motion and the debate, was that, you know, people were concerned that the power of Parliament should be enhanced rather than diminished. And for 1,000 years we debated the relative power of the executive and Parliament, but I think there was a feeling in the 80s that this needed to be redressed. After all, Margaret Thatcher didn't exactly lead a shower and retiring government.
With the Commons split down the middle, there was a passionate debate.
If they do televise it, they will only televise a televised House, which will be quite different from the House of Commons we've known.
And is it not at least absurd and anachronistic, and put at worst, in my view, positively patronising, that you can read reports of this place, that you can listen to our proceedings on the radio, that you can come to the public gallery and see them, that they are reported on vicariously, but you are not allowed actually to view them?
I have no doubt that the cameras in this place would be used by those in this House who have no respect for Parliament and its procedures, those who defy the chair and even vote against acceptance of the authority of the chair. It would be used by some broadcasters as entertainment, and by others, not least in concert with those who have no respect for Parliament, to create events and to dictate the agenda of this House for their purpose.
I said timidity and fear. Timidity and fear that we can't ourselves, this House, with all its resources, control BBC and ITV producers who are dependent upon our continuing goodwill to have access here to the cameras. My God, if we can't control them, how on earth is this House ever going to control ministers with powerful civil servants sitting behind them? If we can't make television and radio accountable to us, we'll never be able to make ministers either.
And finally, the vote was passed.
Order! Order!
The ayes to the right, 318.
Yes!
The noes to the left, 260.
Immediately after the debate, BBC News Night's Adam Raphael got together some of the leading campaigners on both sides of the divide.
Well, I was depressed by the debate. I thought it was a pretty scruffy debate, but I think we won, partly because the new members are more in favour than the old ones, partly because there's a feeling that it has to come and we've resisted it too long, and I think Tony Nelson gave a great speech, and we've done a good organisational job in getting members out.
Roger Gale, you were strongly against televising the House. Isn't this not only a blow for you, but also for Mrs Thatcher personally?
Well, I heard your introduction a few minutes ago, and I thought when you said it then it was absolute rubbish, and I still do.
Why do you think that?
It's not a blow for Mrs Thatcher at all. It may prove to be a blow for democracy. I think if the House...
She was strongly against it, Roger Gale.
I think if the House had heard the introduction that you gave, the result might have been different, because in there they've been saying this is just an experiment, and out here you've been saying this is a night in parliamentary history and it's all different. Well, it's either one or the other.
Tony Nelson, a night of parliamentary history or just sheer rubbish, as Mr Gale suggests?
No, obviously, I think it was an historic step forward. Yes. I was very pleased, actually, with the debate, and I think the House listened to the arguments presented on all sides, and I was very pleased that on a free vote, so many members across the House and a broad cross-section of all parties made up their own mind and did so decisively.
Joe Ashton, why didn't your party listen to you on this occasion? You've been strongly against all these years. In the past, they've listened to you. Tonight, they ignored you.
Too many new amateurs who don't realise what a superb professional Mrs Thatcher is. She'll take this defeat in her stride. She'll organise the cameras in that place with planted questions, ministerial statements, underhand lobs every day, which she can knock out of the chamber. She'll see who gets the benefit out of this, and the amateurs like Austin here, they'll find it'll set us back all the way.
Why then is she opposed to it, Joe? I mean, it is actually a great milestone. Look, here we are taking television, bringing the people into the chamber, showing them what's going on. Don't be grudging about it. It's a great occasion.
Of course it is. And it'll change the face. That stops being the Palace of Westminster, becomes a Palace of Varieties.
Oh, rubbish.
It becomes entertainment, not government. You're an entertainer. You're OK, and that's how it goes.
Austin Mitchell, let me just put it to you. Weren't you a bit worried by Neil Kinnock's tactics and Frank Dobson's tactics in going for Mrs Thatcher? It obviously annoyed many Tories, not just...
I don't think it should be a party issue because it's a basic issue of democracy.
Yeah.
The chamber is stronger if it's got roots in public opinion. And I think that's the way it's got to be. There's many a step. We now have to have a select committee. There has to be another vote. So it isn't in yet. It isn't all over. And there'll be a rearguard action, no doubt. But it's a big majority in favour of momentum to get television in, and that's what we want.
Roger Gale, not a historic night. Do you think, in fact, after the experiment is completed, they're going to throw the cameras out again?
I said in there it was a Trojan horse. I think it is, but I'm not going to be dogging the manger about it. We've got to make it work. The name of the game now is damage control. As far as I'm concerned, we'll control the damage. I felt 20 years ago, and to some extent I still feel, that the introduction of the television cameras into the House of Commons would change the nature of the chamber. That actually it wasn't being done for any noble reasons of enhancing the democratic process, but it was being done for the benefit of the News at 9, as it then was in the News at 10, with a view to tarting that up with some sexy pictures.
Roger had strong feelings and made them known. There were heated conversations and debate in the House about the implications of televising. I think many people were concerned about their own particular appearance, how they would get on in the chamber. People worried about whether they were televisual. They worried about whether their absence would be noticed in the chamber. That some even worried that they might have to wear makeup. But I think in the end the arguments prevailed and there's no going back.
The broadcasters are ready to pull out all the stops and begin that autumn, but not so fast. First, they had to set up a select committee to draw up a set of rules, and they talked and they talked. In fact, it wasn't for another 21 months before the cameras were switched on. Reading through the select committee reports of the time, you get an idea of how wary some MPs were. I'll give you an example. In cases of unparliamentary behaviour, the director should normally focus on the occupant of the chair. That means if there's any trouble, you cut straight to the Speaker. And then we do not think it likely that the House will be willing to accept a regime which accorded complete freedom to the director to select whatever shots he deemed conducive to good television. And that means you don't want the camera zooming in on an MP doing something embarrassing like scratching his ear. The then Deputy Speaker at the time, Betty, now Lady Boothroyd, was well placed to get a sense of the mood of the House.
There were quite loud voices who didn't want us to have television. Let me tell you, for my part, I always voted in favour of broadcasting and television because I feel that the Commons is the nation's forum. And the electors, the country, must know what goes on there. And if they don't like it, what do? There's a button, they can turn it off. So that has been, I've always been very passionate about televising. But of course, there was nervousness about it. And there were sort of some show-offs too. They wanted to be on camera, raising points of order, doing all sorts of things, hoping that Auntie Annie would see them on the camera.
Meanwhile, while MPs were discussing the best way of televising their proceedings, the broadcasters were getting down to work. Now, this place brings back the memories. It's Methodist Central Hall, and it's just across the way from Parliament over there. And it was here the BBC decided to make its original hub of televising Parliament. And so much had to be done. You needed to build office space, you needed to put in edit suites, you needed a studio, you had to lay miles of cables, and you had to bring in truckloads of equipment. It was organised chaos. The editor of the BBC's original coverage of Westminster, Mike Broadbent, captured the scene.
The kitchen was renamed the Annex and earmarked as an office for the editor with secretarial and financial help. And still a kitchen as well. An area on the other side of the building, called the mezzanine, turned out to be ideal, if rather small, for editing suites, with the nearby Weatherhead room where some of the early project meetings were held as an editorial overflow area and offline studio for recording links.
Order! Order!
And finally it happened. November the 21st, 1989, the day of the Queen's speech, and the House of Commons opened its door to television.
The question is...
As always, the first person to feature was Mr. Speaker himself, at the time Bernard Wetherill. But within a few minutes of broadcasting starting, MPs were already trying to get themselves noticed, raising points of order.
As many as of that opinion say... Order! Mr. Cryer!
What concerns me, Mr. Speaker, is that I fully support the access of members to this House and for the obstruction of members to be completely removed. But I can recall, not very long ago, Mr. Speaker, when some members of the citizenry, students, wanted to come to this House and express a point of view, and I think it's important that the House consider extending these rights to the citizens and taxpayers who actually pay for this institution.
The first MP to make a proper speech on camera, though, was the late Ian Gow. A staunch opponent of letting in the cameras, he referred to a letter he'd received from an image consultant about preparing for being on TV.
The letter went on, and you may think that this was an extravagant claim so far as myself is concerned, but the letter went on, "We can guarantee to improve your appearance." Through a personal and confidential image consultation, you will learn if you need a new hairstyle. And where to get it.
Bringing in the cameras on Queen's Speech Day pulled the viewers right into the middle of the confrontation between the party leaders. But it also got other MPs' faces on TV, many of them still around.
I want you to judge the atmosphere at this moment in our province.
I have long believed that the sole use of interest rates to deal with inflation is counterproductive and inflationary in itself.
Mr. Speaker, could you make them behave, please?
Hear, hear. Order, order. I don't really think the Honourable Lady needs my protection, but order. But she shall have it.
For the big supporters of Commons broadcasting, it was a great moment.
I was very grateful that after the long years of resistance, which
pompous non-entities had been saying, you know, what it should be done for the first time, and all this kind of resistance. Totally vacuous, and they were afraid it was going to debase the chamber and turn our debates into the free-for-alls, physical violence, Heseltine grabbing the mace and waving it round. These were the fears that were held out, all totally realistic. So on that day, it was enormously exciting.
Bringing proceedings to a close on that first televised day was the then Deputy Speaker Betty Boothroyd.
The contrary, no, the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order.
When I was in the Speaker's chair and we were being televised, I was never aware of the cameras. I tell you why, because I had blinkers on. I was so concentrating on my business and what to do. And of course, when the Speaker stands, the cameras come onto the Speaker. That is an agreement we have with the television people here. And so it was always maybe a point of order, or somebody was making too much noise. So I was concentrating on what was happening in the chamber, and I never was aware of the cameras. I don't know whether my mascara on, and I didn't have any lipstick on. I never really worried about that. I was worried about doing the job and not worrying about the cameras.
Chris Jones now compiles and presents...
Just as parliamentarians were trying to get used to this brave new world of television, so the broadcasters were finding their feet as well. The Ireland Assembly committees... The BBC's flagship programme was Westminster Live, the live programme covering the then twice-weekly Prime Minister's questions on Tuesdays and Thursday afternoons. It was presented by Vivian White from a little studio in a former air raid shelter across the road from Parliament.
Good afternoon and welcome to Westminster Live. At 3:15, Mrs Thatcher answers Prime Minister's questions. The ever-worsening ambulance...
Vivian, it looks a lot more decrepit than I remember it.
I think we've been invited here for a reason, at least I have. We are relics of a bygone age. Once upon a time, this was clean and smart, the home of parliamentary broadcasting. Look at us now.
I used to think when you walked into this place, look at this door, you've got the metal bolts in there and studs, and you think to yourself, it used to look like the new Avengers, didn't it? You go in there, no one would realise what was happening behind that door.
Well, that's true, but when you went in there, the subterfuge upon the audience was not to tell you you were in a studio, but to emphasise that we were in Westminster. It wouldn't have surprised you at all if a liveried retainer had shuffled in mid-programme and offered one a sherry. It was just that sort of thing. We were in Parliament, deferring to Parliament.
Let's look at this place now. As you say, we've down here we've got all the weeds, we have the ivy growing, but how many years? 20-odd years ago, it was in this garden where a huge van was lifted over. That was amazing. I think there are fewer more bizarre studios than this. As I say, you've got the medieval wall. Apparently it's medieval. It couldn't be knocked down when the BBC wanted to put in equipment round the back. It had to be lifted over. And although this ivy is absolutely genuine, I'm told that to hide the old van that was lifted over, that had all the equipment in, they had to cover it with a fiberglass wall that looked just like this.
Well, the ivy may be genuine, you and I may be genuine, but the wall was fake, and, whisper it quietly, the books behind my head were fake. And we got sniffy letters about that. So, if we cannot trust the books behind you, what else can we trust about this?
I'm told they were hugely expensive at that bookcase, the fake books. It would have been cheaper just to put real books in.
It was genuinely one of the best fake bookcases in the business.
Such was the success of broadcasting the House of Commons, it was decided a year later, in 1990, that the experiment should become a permanent fixture.
Well, initially it was a trial process, and I recognised that with the divisions in the House, we weren't going to get a full swoop televising of the House through in one go. But if I introduced in the motion a temporary trial period, then that had the advantage that nobody could really vote against that as a trial, and when it became permanent, it would be a fait accompli.
So, did the TV cameras really change people's behaviour? Frank Doran is the Labour MP who chairs the Commons Administration Committee. It's their job to keep an eye on the broadcasting issues.
Well, it did at the start. I think everybody looked smarter and neater and pressed their suits and ties and made sure their hair was washed in the morning. And there were lots of little tricks. You know, everyone knew that the 30 seconds after the Prime Minister sat down after question times was a live feed, so everyone tried to get in with a point of order or whatever. But very quickly that then went, died, and nowadays people just accept it as normal. It's part of the furniture almost, in exactly the same way that everything you say is recorded on Hansard, it's recorded on film, and people just get on with it.
But as with all new developments, have things really turned out as planned?
There was something that we got to call donutting, and it was particularly with the minority parties, because of course they don't get the same time to speak as the major parties. So a speaker from a minority party would be called to speak, and the others would come and move around him like a donut, one at either side, one there, and that was called donutting, and that went on for some time. But members got used to being televising, and now, you know, well, not just now, but some years ago, I don't even think they give it another thought.
It was only gradually that people began to seize the opportunities, because in those days, when it started, the existing television channels were a bit more conscientious and actually did more coverage. Nowadays, the coverage is essentially reduced to Prime Minister's Question Time, which is a kind of glorified custard pie session, which I think, personally, I don't find it worthwhile attending because it's so silly.
From this television control room in a basement in the heart of the parliamentary estate, live pictures come from the Commons, from the Lords, and highlights of the select committees. It's become so accepted, it's hard to imagine debates carrying on behind closed doors. Everything from the briefest Westminster Hall exchanges on the closure of a post office to a big set-piece debate on going to war, they've been captured for all to see.
I intend to join those tomorrow night who vote against military action now. It is for that reason, and that reason alone, and with a heavy heart, that I've resigned from the government.
Debating with him at this dispatch box has been exciting and fascinating and fun and an enormous challenge, and from my point of view, wholly unproductive. It is in every sense. And in fact, I have to tell you, I'm told that in my time at this dispatch box, I have now asked him 1,118 direct questions. No one has counted the answers, Mr. Speaker. But
Order. This House is now suspended. Order. The House is now suspended. Order. 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 The honourable member must withdraw. Order. Name the honourable member. I name the honourable member for Hayes and Harlington.
On a point of order, as you'll be aware, members on all sides have now tabled a substantive motion calling for a vote of no confidence in you. When will members be allowed to choose a new Speaker with the moral authority to clean up Westminster and the legitimacy to lift this House out of the mire?
Order.
Broadcasting is here to stay, but politicians are still not entirely content. Now, we've been doing some research, and it shows that MPs down there still have their suspicions about broadcasting. Peers, on the other hand, down to the other end of the corridor, they seem happier about it. But the view of MPs is that Parliament both looks and feels different on television than the way they think it really is. And that raises the question, is that the fault of the broadcasters, or is it something the Commons authorities should be looking at?
I think if we rush into things, we don't always get it right. And this institution has been here more or less on this site for several centuries. It does evolve slowly, and we were, for example, behind the Lords when it came to broadcasting. But at the end of the day, we get there, and we've evolved. It's working, and in this modern day and age of transparency and accountability, people can see us whenever they like. We look at the rules regularly. We looked at them quite recently. We decided to loosen them up a little bit, partly in response to what the BBC was telling us about viewing figures. Just for example, whenever there was a vote, we insisted in our rules that any noise from the chamber was cut out, just in case you picked up a stray conversation, for example. Now, the feedback we got from the television companies was that that's when people switched off. So we want people to continue to watch, so there is now a sound, a noise there, the hubbub that you get when members are congregating, getting ready right to vote. These little things is part of the evolution. They're part of the evolution, and it's, we think, improved the broadcasting opportunity.
So where do we go from here? Well, the BBC is doing its bit. It's making pictures more widely available on the internet. Not just live coverage, but easily accessible archive material too. You'll be able to see what your MP's been saying in the Commons. And maybe the cameras will be given a little more freedom in what they can show. After all, when we're sitting in the press gallery, we're looking at all the MPs, not just the one on his feet. MPs may be a little uncomfortable about that at first, having the big brother camera making them on their best behaviour. But at a time when they've never been so much under the microscope, would it hurt so much if they were under the camera lens